Hello and welcome. I'm Sharon Davey, Director of the University of Virginia Women's Center. It's my honor this afternoon to introduce to you Janet Napolitano, Governor of Arizona, recipient of the 2004 University of Virginia Distinguished Alumna Award, and a woman of great courage and vision. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge and thank the law school for the support that they have given for this day, for Governor Napolitano's visit in many ways, including the reception that will follow immediately after Janet Napolitano's remarks right out here in this beautiful garden. So I hope you all will join us. In 2002, during her inaugural remarks, Governor Napolitano noted that, quote, "Generations to come will not remember us for how we balanced the budget or how we expanded or contracted the size of government. Instead, they will remember how we educated our children, how we protected our seniors, how we built a new economy, and how we made this wonderful state an even better place to live." Throughout her life, Janet Napolitano has illustrated this insight. She has dedicated herself to giving voice to the voiceless, to a commitment to justice, and to planting seeds of hope for the future. I'm going to highlight just a few of the many achievements that she already has come to in her life. I know sometimes this can feel like an obituary when I'm talking about the life of Janet Napolitano. She's got a lot more to go in front of her. But there are so many. It's hard, and I know you want to listen to her, so I'm leaving out quite a bit. But just to hit a few. Going way back, Governor Napolitano's success in political life was predicted early in 1974 while participating in the National Youth Program Girls State. She was appointed Lieutenant Governor of New Mexico. After graduating from Santa Clara University, she came here, we are lucky, to the University of Virginia Law School, where she received many honors, including a Dillard Fellowship and membership in the Raven Society. She remains an active alumna who is generous with her time and expertise. And I have to add here, after spending the day with her, that she is also one of the most engaging, funniest, think-on-your-feet people that I have ever met. She has already spoken with 3 very different groups of people on grounds. We've been working her hard, and she met each group where they were. She reached them, she connected with them in ways that mattered, and she somehow made it that we all had fun while she did that. Back to those milestones. After leaving the University of Virginia, Governor Napolitano began a distinguished career, first in the private sector and then in the public sector. While in her early 30s, she had the distinction of being the youngest lawyer ever to receive the highest rating awarded by the Martindale-Hubbell Directory, a national publication that assesses attorney skills. In 1993, Janet Napolitano became the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. During her tenure, she responded vigorously to a number of law enforcement challenges, including drug trafficking and crimes against Native American citizens. She managed the prosecution of 6,000 criminals, more than any other federal prosecutor in Arizona history. Her dedication to safety and the prevention of violence led Janet Napolitano to pursue the office of State Attorney General. Successful in achieving this office, Arizona Attorney General Napolitano was the first woman ever to hold this position. Janet Napolitano's commitment to advocacy on behalf of children, women, senior citizens, and others was quickly recognized. She dedicated unprecedented resources to child abuse and neglect cases. She established a cybercrimes investigative unit to hold internet predators accountable for their actions. And early in her tenure, Janet Napolitano made violence against women a public priority for the state. "I pledge to do everything within the powers of my office to curb domestic abuse," she emphasized publicly. She established the first state office for women, allocated resources under the Violence Against Women Act, and spearheaded a campaign to inform victims of sexual crimes about their rights. In 2002, our distinguished alumna sought a larger platform for her work. Campaigning on the pledge to be a governor for all Arizonans, she ran for the top office of her state. Voters responded enthusiastically, and an unprecedentedly broad coalition of supporters spanning all ethnic, geographical, and age groups helped to bring her into the governor's office. Continuing to blaze new trails, Governor Napolitano became on January 6, 2002, America's first woman to succeed another woman as a state governor. I was speaking to someone from her home state right before getting up here, and she made the point that that's a really good thing. You know, not always to be the first, but in this case, the first to come after another woman, to see that as something that becomes normalized is part of what she's helping to do. Her new goals as governor included developing a plan to allow low-income seniors to buy prescription drugs at reduced prices, dramatically reorganizing and strengthening child protective services in the state, and funding a pilot program for full-day kindergarten in Arizona. Her challenges, which include the daunting and difficult task of balancing the state's budget, a difficulty we know something about here in Virginia, have been many. Her responses have been thoughtful and strong. Reaching across political borders and building meaningful consensus, Governor Napolitano is actively creating a more just society. The University of Virginia Distinguished Alumna Award was created and is sustained by the University of Virginia Women's Center Advisory Council. On behalf not just of the Women's Center, but of the university, I thank them for that. In the many years that this award has been given, I think it's safe to say that there has never been a greater level of enthusiasm from students, from faculty, from community members, and from alumni than that which has greeted this year's recipient. Please join me in welcoming back home to the University of Virginia our 2004 Distinguished Alumna, Governor Janet Napolitano.
Thank you very much. I was just ready to let Sharon keep on talking. That was lovely, and it's a great honor to receive the award this year and to look at the list of those who have gone before me. I feel like I'm being added to quite a distinguished group of women who have graduated from the university, either as undergraduates or from one of its graduate schools. I, of course, attended the law school, graduating in 1983, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of being able to come back from time to time over the past few years, once to participate in a program where practicing lawyers were introduced into the classroom, where I was able to talk to a class about immigration law, and also to another class about white-collar prosecution, and then last year to participate in the Public Service Conference. So it's been a good relationship. I also came back last year for my 20-year law school reunion, and that was quite nice to see the classmates. I see Missy here, with whom we had shared so many good times, and to get back together and talk about all those who didn't show up. It was really a wonderful time. I came to Arizona after law school, not knowing that I was going to live in Arizona. Almost by accident. I knew I wanted to live in the West. I had applied for federal appellate clerkships in the 9th and 10th circuits. Those are the federal courts of appeal that occupy the western states, and was fortunate to get a clerkship with Judge Mary Schroeder, now the Chief Judge of the 9th Circuit, and her chambers happened to be in Phoenix. And that's how I came to go to Arizona for a one-year clerkship 20 years ago. And in retrospect, that turned out to be a very fortuitous decision, because if there's anything that can be said about Arizona, it is that there are virtually no barriers to entry. And another thing that can be said about Arizona, as has been hinted in the introduction, is that it turns out to have quite a strong history where the election of women or women in leadership positions is concerned. It was one of the first 10 states in the country to give women the right to vote. It has had one of the highest percentages of women legislators of any state. It sent one of the first women to Congress, Isabella Greenway, in the 1930s. We elected the first woman state Supreme Court justice of any state. That was Lorna Lockwood. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman to serve as a state Senate Majority Leader. And then, of course, she got another job, being the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Margaret Hance was the first woman to serve as the mayor of a major city when she served as the mayor of Phoenix. And when I was elected Attorney General, I was the first woman to be elected Attorney General, but it was a year in which all 5 state constitutional office holders, from governor to Secretary of State, Attorney General, Treasurer, and Superintendent of Public Instruction, all elected that year were women. Now, the other 4 were Republicans, but we can talk about that part in a minute. But and we were called collectively the Fab Five. And we were pointed out as part of the oddities of the 1998 election cycle, in addition to Jesse Ventura. So Arizona, it turns out for me, and I could not and did not know this ahead of time, was a very good place for a young woman who wanted to practice law, who wanted to hit the ground running, and who thought maybe ultimately she would go into public service and perhaps into political life. Was a good place to land. Now, that's how I got to Arizona, and that's a little bit about Arizona. But being a governor is a somewhat different kettle of fish. And I want to talk with you a little bit about the experience of women as governors, and then get to a fundamental question, which is, does it make any difference whether your governor is a woman or a man? But let's talk about the history of women as governors in these United States. By the way, there have been 25 women governors in American history, and 3 of them are from Arizona. I don't think any of them are from Virginia. Just checking. Now, if you kind of look at the history of women serving as governors, there really are kind of 2 chapters. In the first chapter, you're really talking about women succeeding their husbands if their husbands died while they were in office. The chapter really began in 1924 when Nellie Taylor Ross was elected governor of Wyoming and Ma Ferguson was elected governor of Texas. They were both elected as proxies for their husbands, and they both campaigned on the promise to follow their husbands' agendas. And that's a very typical way on how in the early 20th century women came to political power. Not until the 1970s would a woman be elected governor in her own right. And that's really the second phase. And that began, of course, with Ella Grasso in Connecticut and Dixie Lee Ray in the state of Washington. And then in the 80s and 90s, we saw an ever-increasing number of women running for governor, although winning was something else again. Now, today, women are governors in 8 states: Arizona, Delaware, Hawaii, Kansas, Louisiana, Michigan, Montana, and Utah. And I'm looking at the list, and I will tell you that the governors of Hawaii, Montana, and Utah are Republicans, so 3 are Republican women and 5 are Democratic women. Most of us have been elected in our own rights, except for Utah, who succeeded Governor Leavitt, who was appointed to be the head of the EPA. Let me make a little side note about my election as governor of Arizona. As I said before, I'm the 3rd. The first was Rose Mofford. She was actually our Secretary of State, and she succeeded to office because the then Governor Evan Mecham was impeached. And we have no lieutenant governor, so the Secretary of State becomes the governor. The second woman governor, Jane D. Hull, succeeded. She was the Secretary of State, too, and that then governor, Fife Symington, was convicted. So I think it's safe to say that, and then she ran for election in her own right for her own term and was elected. So we can't talk too much about Arizona having 3 governors because I think I'm the first one who's actually, as we like to say, run from scratch and won. Now, the question becomes, does it make any difference whether women are governor or not? And you start with the beginning question, which every woman candidate has gotten in some form or another. And the question goes something like this: Janet, do you intend to run to be a woman governor? Think about that. I am a woman. By definition, I will be a woman governor. Hello? But the point underlying the question is, I think, more serious, and that is your agenda, is your leadership going to be somehow different because you are a woman? And I think the answer is somewhat mixed. In the first instance, I would say some things, yes, are different. Because I think anyone who's in a position of political leadership or public leadership, your decisions, your priority setting, are guided by your life experience and the prism through which you view things. And so it is not surprising that when I was Attorney General, I made the top priority of the office clearing out a backlog of 6,000 child abuse cases involving about 10,000 children. Those cases had been sitting in the office for several years. The area of the office was understaffed. It was just not a priority. And it seemed to me that it was a basic responsibility of an Attorney General's office to deal with families in crisis, particularly when children's legal rights were in legal limbo. And so that was something that I think none of my male predecessors had even perceived as an issue, much less taken on as an issue. Coming into the governorship, I made the top priorities education, early education before first grade, and also post-high school education, thinking of that whole education continuum that is so important for the 21st century. And while my predecessors all said education was their top priority, their budgets didn't reflect that statement. And whenever a political leader starts talking to you about therefore this or that, the first question out of one's mouth ought to be, what's your budget? And what have you done financially? Because that's where a statement about priorities is given true meaning. I think for governors, and particularly for women governors, there's a little bit of a difference between women governors and women in other elected positions. Certainly in the Congress with people like Nancy Pelosi, we have many outstanding women leaders. But in Congress and in legislative bodies, one can kind of pick and choose which issues you want to make a big deal about, that you want to focus on, that you want to be known as or branded by, or whatever phrase one selects. But when one is a governor, oftentimes the issues pick you. For example, when I came into office, I said we were going to balance the budget. We were going to focus on quality public education. We were going to move into having preschool and postgraduate opportunities beyond those which we currently have. We were going to bring prescription drug price release to our seniors. Those are all part of my proactive agenda. These are how we want to move our state forward. I didn't say I was going to be an expert on the problems of western forests and how to deal with mega fires in the Southwest. Fires of 200, 300, 400,000 acres. But that problem found me. I didn't choose to be America's most knowledgeable governor on petroleum pipelines. But when the pipeline that brought about 2/3 of Phoenix gasoline into Phoenix ruptured last August and was down for over a week, and 85% of our gas stations were closed, and people were waiting in long, long lines for hours and over 110-degree heat, I quickly became an expert on petroleum pipelines. I never expected to be an expert on hostage negotiations. But last January the 18th, I got a call early in the morning that 2 of our prison guards, officers, had been taken hostage in a tower by 2 inmates. And that was all of a sudden the #1 item on my leadership agenda. Now let's talk about this a minute, because it does illustrate some differences in leadership style. So we're moving now from a discussion of does it make a difference in terms of the issues you confront to leadership style. Now let me explain the prison situation for you. This is the Lewis Prison in Arizona. It's outside of Buckeye, Arizona. In the middle of, it's a maximum security prison, and in the middle of the yard, it's a relatively new prison, in the middle of the yard is a very high tower. And the tower was designed to be impregnable so that if there were ever a riot in the yard, the guards could retreat into the tower and no one could get to them. And also within the tower was the guards' arsenal, including some very high-powered weapons, plus the pharmacy for all the prisoners. Now, it turns out that this was one of the few state contracts actually built to spec, and this tower was indeed impregnable. So we had a situation where you had two very serious criminals, one serving a natural life sentence and one serving almost a natural life sentence, with a male and a female hostage officer in the tower. And they had high firepower, AR-10s, for those of you who know anything about firepower. They were spraying the yard with ammunition. And the tactical team told us, the SWAT teams and so forth that assembled out there, that they had no clear tactical option. Okay. Now, that was the situation. So if you don't have a tactical option, your only resort is a negotiation option. And that's what we embarked to do. Now, the head of the Department of Corrections, who is an appointee of the governor, is the first woman in Arizona to serve as the head of a Department of Corrections. And she formerly was the head of the Missouri Department of Corrections, where she served for about 8 years. And she's a very petite, small woman with a very quiet voice, and she's just about the toughest person, pound for pound, that I've ever met. And we brought in professional negotiators, federal from the FBI, some from our state police hostage negotiation teams, city police hostage negotiation teams, and made the decision that unless there were an opportunity, there was a standing shoot-to-kill order. If they could ever get both of the inmates in sight, they had a shoot-to-kill order, but if they did not, then we were going to try to talk these guys out. And it took 15 days, the longest hostage negotiation in American prison history. And it was, there was an increasing, as time went on, increasing pressure both from within the law enforcement community and in the public. Why aren't you storming the tower? Why don't you send in the troops and storm the tower? Why are you talking with these guys? And the answer was, the tower was surrounded by 1/8 of a mile in all directions of barren ground. These guys were up high with high-powered rifles, so not only would they kill the hostages, they would undoubtedly kill or injure the officers or many of the officers going in. And so the director's decision, which I supported, was to negotiate and negotiate and negotiate. And, you know, sometimes it takes a great deal of strength not to use your weapons, but to stand back. And if we had stormed the tower, I think there would have been very bad results. Now, one of the hostages was a male and one was a female. And they released the male after a week, and so we were left with a female hostage who had been sexually assaulted inside on the first day. And we didn't know what exactly was going on. We finally got her out on day 15 with the 2 inmates. Super Bowl Sunday, I'll always remember this. And the director and I went to the roof of the hospital where she was being air-evac'd to meet her as she was being taken into the hospital. And I remember her, she was lying on the gurney, she'd been in this awful situation for 15 days. They hadn't given her much to eat, you know, all these kinds of things. And she just grabbed the director's hand and she said, "Thank you for not storming the tower, they would have killed me." And it turns out now that they would have, and they basically, whenever one of the inmates was visible by sniper, the other one was downstairs with a gun next to her head. So that was the situation. Now, why do I raise this in the context of this lecture or discussion? I raise it because I suspect, although I do not know, but I suspect that if there had been a prior Department of Corrections director and at least one prior governor, they would have stormed the tower. And then they would have gone in the press and said, aren't we tough? You know, we did it. We're not going to take any guff from these inmates. We're going to storm the tower. And they would have been left with several dead officers and 2 dead hostages. But they would have thought they looked tough. And I think there's a difference between, you know, looking tough and sounding tough and, in your own way, being tough and measuring yourself by the results that you obtain. I don't say that to say that men are bad leaders. I just simply to say that I have seen differences in leadership style that I think that episode symbolizes or represents. And that now it's very interesting that the legislature, which in our state is the leadership is all male, is conducting their own investigation of that situation, and their question is, why didn't you storm the tower? You know, so it's not like this was a made-up difference. It clearly is a difference. Now, we have a lot to do in our state as people do in Virginia or from other states that you are coming from. And the question arises, is there a role for men and women leaders? Is there something different that would make a real difference? And, oh, by the way, why aren't more women running for president? What's a question I'm asked a lot. Well, one of the reasons is that successful presidential candidates, a lot of them have come out of governorships. And there have been 25 women governors total. And that will change over time. But I think the second is that people need to get used to women confronting complex, difficult problems that maybe are not as clear-cut as, say, Lincoln in the Civil War, FDR with World War II, or even JFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But taking on issues like, how do you really improve a public education system? How do you make sure that your elders have access to health care on a reasonable basis? How do you work in the government side with the private sector to stimulate the economy so that you close the increasing wage gap between those who make the highest and those who do not, which is, I think, a growing problem in the United States that not many people are talking about. Those are difficult issues that involve a different evaluation of leadership. And men have skills to bring to that table, but women certainly do as well. We have in Arizona, I think, a unique opportunity. Unlike Virginia, we are a relatively new state. We are a wide open state. We are a rapidly growing state. In a way, we are a state that is constructing itself as we speak. February in Arizona is Arizona History Month. And I met with a lot of fourth graders, because fourth graders are where you learn about state history in our school curricula. And it was a nice break from dealing with the legislature, so it was good. But I would look at those Arizona fourth graders, and I told them, I said, you are a very special class. Do you know why? And they didn't know. I said, those fourth graders will graduate from high school the year that Arizona turns 100. So they're our centennial class. And we're going to follow them year to year to year and do some things with them. But I say that only to give you an indication of the difference between a young state and an older state. And then also to say that I'm always looking at what Arizona is going to look like in the year 2012. Just as I hope people in Virginia are thinking about what Virginia is going to look like in 2012, and what I hope Americans are thinking about, not just what America is going to look like in January of 2005, but what we are going to look like in 2012. And if you keep those kind of long-term goals, and you kind of think of how you get there, and you keep prioritizing the issues that are of importance to you and to others, the day-to-day stuff can get done, but you don't lose sight of a longer-term vision. And that requires leadership from men and it requires leadership from women. It's not one, it's not the other, and it's both, and it's our time. Thank you. I'm free to take questions. Yes?
How did you get the hostage release?
The question was, how do we get the hostage release? The negotiations were very interesting. They started off the first day, they wanted helicopters and pizzas. They got neither. But as the days went on, we would give things for other things. For example, you know, they wanted fast food hamburgers and cigarettes, and which we sent to them, and we used a robot to actually go out to the tower, so no humans actually went out there, but it was a robot with kind of a carrying arm on it, would take that stuff out if they then gave us some of their ammunition. So everything was a trade, and it was a constant back and forth and back and forth. Then it was very frustrating because there wasn't a lot to trade. These guys had to trade for, and they talked several times about they were just going to take out some officers, then kill our hostages, and then kill themselves. They were, you know, they're lifetime inmates. They didn't have anything to lose. We ultimately negotiated them to come out. We went back into their files, and we had psychological profilers looking through their records, and they both had extensive records, as you might imagine. And discovered, looked at who they'd been corresponding with while they were in prison, which family members had come to see them, and brought those family members to Arizona to talk with to the inmates on the phone. And then basically the arrangement was that if they would come out, we would move them to a prison in a state near their home states. And that was the deal. Now, this is the way that works. From day one, those prisoners were never going to see an Arizona State prison again for two reasons. One, they knew the interior of the tower, so they had too much information which they could share with other inmates. And secondly, they would be kind of parading around in the prison community as kind of proud peacocks that they'd done this great thing, and there was no way we were going to let that happen. Thirdly, and this was an issue in some other prison hostage situations, we were afraid that perhaps other officers would harm them if they were in our population based on what they had done. So they were going to go out of state under any circumstance. And what we ultimately agreed was they could go to states near their home states in exchange for the lives of our hostages. So that was how that went. It was a very difficult, as you might imagine, 15 days. Yeah? Well, with me here today is Donna Busella, who's a graduate of the University of Virginia, who directs the President's 24/7 Terrorism Center. She probably knows more about terrorism than anybody around, but she can't tell you much or she'd have to shoot you. But I think that a couple of things. One is, traditionally, when you get into a law enforcement or military mode, it's viewed that women don't have credibility. That's, we're softer. We want to talk about education and health care as if those are not somehow important issues. But in reality, particularly in the last decade or two, you've seen women leading, law enforcement agencies, leading prosecutions of terrorism or terrorism-related cases. And you see people like Condi Rice. Think what you want about Condi Rice, but she's right there, and she's the President's lead advisor where many of these issues are concerned. And I'll give you an example of the way things are changing. I remember going to a meeting. I was a U.S. attorney. A U.S. attorney is a chief federal prosecutor for a particular area. I was for Arizona. And you're part of the overall Department of Justice structure so that you report to the Attorney General of the United States. And I remember going to a meeting at the Department of Justice, and the Attorney General has an office, and then there's a big conference room next to it. And the Attorney General I reported to was Janet Reno. But there was this huge conference table, And I looked around the table, and the head of the criminal division was a woman, the head of the immigration service was a woman, the head of the Bureau of Prisons was a woman, the head of the tax division and the antitrust divisions were women, the head of the executive office of U.S. attorneys was a woman, and the chair of the Attorney General's advisory committee was a woman. And it was an illustration of how things slowly but surely are changing. I do think it would have been very difficult for me to be elected as an Attorney General without first having been perceived as a prosecutor. Being elected to a law enforcement perceived job, even though the job of Attorney General is much broader than law enforcement, but that's what people elect Attorney Generals to be, is a law enforcement person. You know, there's a skepticism that women can do that. But once they get used to you announcing indictments and guilty, and convictions and, taking public positions on law enforcement matters, it becomes easier. I think I would not have been elected governor had I not served as the Attorney General. And again, it was putting myself before the public as someone who could deal with tough issues. We had a lot of very difficult death penalty work when I was the Attorney General. We had 12 executions in those 4 years in Arizona. And think of that on a per capita basis, and you'll realize it was probably almost the highest per capita of any state. Maybe Texas or Florida were higher, but I don't think any other, and some of them were very controversial. So, you get used to that. Now, what we have to avoid on the terrorism side is to make it look like it's a, how do I say this? I think it's important that we deal with terrorism not by saying, I'm bigger than you are, kind of a typical, bull moose fighting in the meadow kind of metaphor, but in terms of actual discussion about what is the most intelligent and intelligence-driven way that we can identify those who abroad who are a risk of committing terrorist acts and those within our country who are either at risk of or preparing to commit terrorist acts. And that's not, that's not a male, that's not a female. It's being much, much smarter on how we do our law enforcement mission. And that, I think, there's opportunities for women all over. Yeah. Yeah, some have been mayors, so they've had prior executive experience. Some have been lieutenant governors. The newly elected governor of Louisiana was the lieutenant governor and just worked her way up. The governor of Hawaii was the mayor of Maui. Now, what a great job that would be. When I grow up, I want to be the mayor of Maui. So there have been other paths. I don't know of a woman governor that has become a governor from the business community. The phenomenon of the wealthy businessman who now is going to give back and either run for the Senate or run for governorship. I know of no woman who has achieved a governorship by that path. I think that's probably still yet to come. Other questions? Yes?
I was just reading today that our Attorney General was saying that in his county where he was president, that all of the homicide cases he prosecuted, started with domestic violence cases. And two questions about domestic violence. One, the issue of, did you find that to be the case, or is that common? And how do we have an issue for file charges and coming up with such?
Right. The question is, I guess there was an article about Attorney General Kilgore in the paper today saying that of the county that he originally had been a prosecutor in, all of the homicides last year were domestic violence related. And the question is, do I have the same experience or similar one? And then secondary to that is, what can we do to get those cases prosecuted and to make primarily women who are the victims? There are occasionally men, but it's primarily women more willing to be witnesses and so forth. This has been a huge issue for us in Arizona. It is our top source of violent crime, not our exclusive source, but our top source. We've had just some horrendous homicides associated with violence in the home. You know, I have even a problem with the phrase domestic violence, because you don't charge domestic violence, you charge, you know, murder 1, murder 2, you know, aggravated assault, whatever the underlying crime is what you charge. Somehow domestic violence, it's different. It is different from a law enforcement officer on the street's perspective, however, because you go into a home situation, people know each other, emotions are high. It can be a very violent situation for a peace officer. You don't know what to expect, and sometimes you go into these houses and people are drunk and they're waving guns around, and you know, we've also had some of our law enforcement officer involved injuries in DV cases as well. We've done a couple of things in Arizona to try to get a handle on this. One is we have 2 statewide groups newly formed. It formed when I was Attorney General. We worked on helping them. One is a group called Employers Against Domestic Violence, to take it on as a business issue, primarily to educate employees about where they can go, you know, to provide shoe cards in restrooms at one's workplace, things of that sort. Shoe cards are cards that tell you where to go, where you can get shelter and so forth, that one can stick in your shoes so nobody knows you have it, like your abusive spouse. So Employers Against Domestic Violence. And the second group is a group called the Men's Anti-Violence Network, and it's composed primarily of CEOs of Arizona-based companies, CEOs and CFOs, you know, the high leadership. And they are aimed at prevention, and a prevention message aimed at boys. And they are, for example, funding a major anti-bullying initiative in our public schools. Why? Because, you know, domestic violence doesn't just start, you know, spontaneously. Usually there's years of things building up, and bullying is one of the key risk factors for somebody as an adult becoming violent in the home. So we're really dealing with that bullying in school situation. You know, you get professional athletes and others involved. It's a very different message than the typical DV message, which is aimed at women and says, this is where you can get a shelter. And I've really tried to discourage the second type of message. Why? Because, first of all, we don't have enough shelter beds, and we run the risk of false promises. We will never have enough shelter beds in this country, given the prevalence of domestic violence. It's a wrong strategy. We have to have enough to provide support where it's needed, but the notion that we're going to shelter our way out of domestic violence, you know, that says nothing about what you do to turn off the spigot to begin with. And that's where the efforts involved with boys, focusing on the bullying, early intervention, in the court system, early intervention, greater batterer accountability, all of those things have been the focus of changes in law enforcement procedures and practices in Arizona. Have we brought down the rate of domestic violence? It depends on how you count. Probably not. Have we slowed the rate of increase? Yes, I think everybody who's looked at the numbers would say the alarming increases we were seeing in the 90s have leveled off. So, but you are exactly right to point it out as a huge, huge problem in our state and in our country. Good. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. I don't know. I would like to do 2 terms as governor. We have a 2-term limit, and I will have a re-election in the year 2006, and it will probably be a pretty tough re-election. I've always had, my goal is to actually win an election on election day, because both of my races, the AG race was decided on Wednesday after the election, and the governor's race was not decided until Sunday. So my goal is to win on Tuesday. I think it's important to set realistic goals. But the things I mentioned this afternoon about, you know, the education system and the universities, you know, those are long-term big projects, and they take more than a year or 2 to get going and to really implement and institutionalize. And I take I take that view, and I take a lot of comfort from reading history and looking at, for example, the political leadership of Arizona in the 30s and 40s and 50s, when Arizona was really just beginning to grow and you know, assume an identity. And the big work then was done on the physical infrastructure, you know, the roads, dams. Big important part of a state like, an arid state like ours is your management of your water and your damming capacity. Bridges, you know, all of those things. The Central Arizona Project, which is a huge, basically aqueduct that brings water from the Colorado River down into the Phoenix area and all the way into central Arizona and into Tucson, which was the largest public works project in the country's history until the Big Dig in Boston, which I don't think will ever be dug totally, but that's another story. But they focused on the long term, and these were, you know, it took 7, 8, 10. The CAP was more than a decade, and just in getting the legislation through and financed and then constructed and so forth. And that is now an essential part of our physical infrastructure as we grow. The way I look at it now, in this decade, in this century, it's the human infrastructure that we need to work on, and the support for the human infrastructure. You know, your educational system, your child care system, your social service system, your elder care system, your transportation system. In a particular sense, what happens when 1 in 4 Arizonans is over the age of 65, and half of those can't drive? You know, what are we doing now to plan for that eventuality, which will hit in about the year 2020? So I think, you know, you look at the long term for the physical infrastructure, now for the human infrastructure. Now, what does that mean for me as a politician? I hope I get to do 2 terms. And then at the end of 2 terms, you know, we'll see what other windows open up. You know, I may decide, you know, I've had enough fun in public life and go do something totally different. You know, there may be another race that's enticing. There may be a Democrat in the White House, and there may be something in D.C. that looks kind of interesting. You really can't tell and you can't predict. You got to kind of go where the opportunities are. Yeah? We don't have one. Yeah, we are what's typically regarded as a battleground state, and a little of the political demographics. Although Arizona is perceived as a very conservative Republican state, in reality, Democrats trail Republicans in voter registration by about 5 points, and registered independents represent about 23% of the registered voters. So let's assume every Republican votes for the Republican candidate and every Democrat votes for the Democrat candidate, and let's assume both sides are able to get their vote out. It's really a battle for the independent voter. That's how I've ultimately won in Arizona, is to do a pretty good job at getting the Democratic base out, but then to do very well among independent voters. So it will be, Bush is going to have to fight to keep Arizona, and Kerry's going to have to fight to take Arizona. And I guess that's what they mean by battleground. Right now, if the election were held today, I think Bush would probably carry Arizona. But by October, when early balloting starts in our state, you start voting by mail 30 days before the general election. And 50 to 60% of the voters will vote by mail 30 days in October. And by early October, it could be, as you know, and as we've seen, a very, very different dynamic. Both candidates will be in and out. They will send surrogates in and out. Kerry's coming in on May the 7th. Bush has been there 3 times this spring. It's going to be an active place. It's very interesting. Arizona has not been a battleground presidential state really ever. So it gives you a perspective on the changing demographics, population, and voter performance in Arizona. Okay. One more question? Last question before the reception. Yeah.
You mentioned that storming the tower would have been an act of perceived strength. I'm just curious whether you see the practice another example.
Can you say it again?
I'm curious whether you see the Warner Act as another example of an action that's directed.
Do I see the Warner Act as the foreign policy equivalent of storming the tower? No, I don't. I think the predicates are very different and the situation is very different. But I do see some of kind of the political rhetoric that's being used and, you know, the kind of accusations, if you don't do this, you're not really, you know, you're not really patriotic or you're not really tough or whatever. That is reminiscent of the sort of the public dynamic that was around our prison hostage crisis. But I think the decision to invade a foreign country, in particular that decision, was based on many more elements than the single element we really faced in the prison hostage situation in Arizona. Well, good. It's been a delight to be with you. We'll see you in the courtyard. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Women's Center, I would like to present you with these flowers. Thank you
thank you.
very much for coming, and I hope you're enjoying your stay.
I'm having a great day. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.